Hello, if you're liking these stories. It'd mean a lot if you hit that like button or subscribed. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your location and the time there. It always amazes me how people all over the world drift off to sleep with these. The age of heroes was ending, and the age of consequences would last forever. Alexios walked through the familiar corridors of the agoge, his footsteps echoing off stone walls that had witnessed countless transformations of boys into warriors. But now those walls seemed to press in on him, their weight suffocating rather than protective. The crimson cloak that had once been his greatest aspiration now felt like a shroud, marking him as something he was no longer sure he wanted to be. The forge of Sparta had done its work, creating weapons from human souls with ruthless efficiency. But in the process, it had created something else: doubt, guilt, and the terrible recognition that perfection might be just another word for monstrosity. The boys who had entered the system as children had emerged as something harder and more dangerous, but also infinitely more fragile. The question that would haunt them for the rest of their days was whether they were still human enough to remember what they had lost, or whether the transformation was complete and irreversible. The forge had done its work, but the metal it had shaped was cracked in ways that might never heal. And in those cracks, the seeds of future destruction were already beginning to take root. In the shadows beyond the walls, Theo watched and waited, his sister's memory burning like a flame that would never be extinguished. The war was far from over. It had only changed its form, becoming something more personal and infinitely more dangerous. The perfect Spartan warriors he had observed from childhood were breaking apart, and he would be there to witness every crack in their armor, every flaw in their perfect facade. The forge of Sparta had created its masterpiece, but masterpieces, like all things touched by human hands, were destined to crumble. And when they did, the world would see what lay beneath the gleaming surface: the broken souls of boys who had been transformed into weapons and discovered too late that weapons could cut both ways. In the mountains, the rebellion continued its work of destruction, but its character had changed. What had begun as a fight for freedom had become a cycle of vengeance that would consume generations. The helots who had dreamed of liberation now dreamed only of making their oppressors suffer as they had suffered. The Perioeci, caught between competing loyalties, withdrew into themselves and waited for the storm to pass. Theo melted back into the shadows, his bow slung across his shoulder, his quiver empty but his hatred fully intact. The Spartan he had spared would carry the wounds of their encounter forever, a living reminder of the price of oppression. It was a more satisfying revenge than simple death could have provided. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist that had shrouded the mountains, revealing the true scope of the devastation. Villages lay in ruins, fields had been burned, and the delicate balance that had maintained peace for generations had been shattered beyond repair. The rebellion had failed in its immediate goals, but it had succeeded in planting seeds of doubt in the very heart of Spartan society. In the agoge compound, new boys arrived to begin their training, their faces bright with the eagerness of youth. They would learn the same lessons, endure the same hardships, and emerge as the same kind of weapons their predecessors had become. The system would continue, as it always had, grinding human souls into shapes that served the collective will. But something had changed. The certainty that had once sustained Spartan society had been replaced by doubt. The unity that had made them invincible had been fractured by moral compromise. The perfect machine of state control was beginning to show cracks, and those cracks would only widen with time. The rebellion has been contained, he finally managed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The helots have been reminded of their place. Brasidas nodded, accepting the report without question. In his world, results were all that mattered. Methods were irrelevant as long as Spartan dominance was maintained. The cost in human suffering was simply the price of maintaining order. "Good," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. "You have proven yourselves worthy of the Crimson Cloak. You have shown that Spartan steel is superior to rebel passion." But as he looked into their eyes, Bruises saw something that troubled him. These boys had lost something in the mountains, something that couldn't be replaced through training or discipline. They had seen too much, done too much, become too much. The perfect weapons he had helped to forge were cracked in ways that might never heal. "Now," he said, his voice taking on the ceremonial tone reserved for the most important lessons. "You are ready to serve." The words hung in the air like a funeral dirge, heavy with meaning that went far beyond their simple phrasing. Ready to serve, but serve what? The state that had sent them to kill children? The system that had turned them into instruments of terror? The ideal of Spartan perfection that had been revealed as nothing more than organized brutality? Alexios stood at attention, his wounded shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat, his mind reeling with images of the dead. Around him, his surviving brothers maintained the same rigid posture, their faces masks of compliance that hid whatever they truly felt. They were ready to serve, as Bruises had said, but the question that haunted them was whether they were still human enough to remember what service was supposed to mean. But her death had not ended the uprising. It had transformed it into something worse. The helots who had fought for freedom now fought for revenge, their attacks becoming more brutal, more indiscriminate. The Perioeci, caught between competing loyalties, were subjected to increased surveillance and suspicion. Trust, the invisible foundation upon which Spartan society had been built, was crumbling like a wall undermined by persistent water. As dawn broke over the olive grove, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Alexios stumbled back toward the city with the surviving members of his unit. Of the 200 who had marched out with such confidence, barely a dozen remained. The rest lay dead in the mountains, their bronze armor no protection against the hatred they had helped to create. The gates of Sparta loomed ahead, their massive stones seeming to press down with the weight of history itself. Behind those walls lay the agoge, where new generations of boys were being forged into weapons for a state that was slowly consuming itself. The process would continue, as it always had, grinding human souls into shapes that served the collective will. Bruises waited for them in the compound courtyard, his scarred face showing no emotion as he surveyed the remnants of the force he had trained. The boys who had left as eager young warriors had returned as something else, harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous, but somehow diminished in ways that went deeper than physical wounds. "Report," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Alexios tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain the children they had killed, the friends they had lost, the moral clarity that had died in the darkness of the mountains? How could he make his instructor understand that the enemy they had faced was not some external threat but the reflection of their own brutality? The shot, when it came, was perfect, a clean kill that would have made his instructors proud. But at the last moment, Alexios made no move to defend himself, no attempt to dodge or raise his shield. He simply knelt there in the dirt, accepting whatever fate had in store for him. The arrow took him in the shoulder, spinning him around but not killing him. Theo had adjusted his aim at the last second, choosing pain over death, prolonging the suffering as his own had been prolonged. "You don't get to die yet," Theo said, his voice cold as winter wind. "You don't get to escape that easily." From the shadows at the edge of the grove, Lysander watched the final act of the tragedy unfold with the detached horror of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. The rebellion was ending, not in victory but in mutual destruction, leaving nothing but ashes and blood in its wake. He had returned to the Ephesus 3 days ago with a report that painted the uprising as a minor disturbance, easily contained and quickly resolved. The truth that Spartan society was tearing itself apart from within was too dangerous to acknowledge. But lies, no matter how necessary, had a way of revealing themselves, and whispers of the real situation were already spreading through the city like plague. The woman Corinna had been captured during the retreat, dragged back to Sparta in chains to face the kind of death reserved for those who dared to challenge the state's authority. Lysander had stood in the crowd as she was tortured in the agora, her screams echoing off the marble columns, while citizens cheered and children learned valuable lessons about the price of rebellion. "What have we become?" he whispered to the dead child. "What have we done?" The answer came not in words but in the bronze dagger he drew from his belt, its blade reflecting the moonlight like a fragment of fallen star. Some truths were too terrible to live with, some knowledge too poisonous to bear. With a movement that was almost gentle, Nicomedes opened his own throat, his blood mixing with the child's in the sacred earth of the grove. Theo found Alexios kneeling beside Cleomenes's body, his sword forgotten in the dirt beside him. The Spartan warrior, the boy who had once represented everything Theo could never be, looked up with eyes that held the same hollow devastation that had haunted the helot quarters for generations. "You," Alexios said, his voice barely a whisper, "you're the one who's been watching us." "I am," Theo replied, his bow drawn and ready. "I've been watching you become monsters. I've been watching you destroy everything you touch." They faced each other across the body of a dead friend, two boys who had been forged by the same system into opposite forms of the same tragedy. Around them, the battle was winding down, the surviving Spartans either dead or fled, their perfect formation shattered by the fury of those they had oppressed. "She was 8 years old," Theo said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated grief. "My sister. She was carrying our mother's mirror, trying to reach safety. Your friend killed her like she was nothing." Alexios closed his eyes, remembering the small body in the ruins, the bronze mirror that had caught the firelight. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring her back," Theo replied, his arrow trained on Alexios's heart. "Sorry doesn't erase what you've done, what you've become." Theo's second arrow took him in the chest, the bronze point sliding between the plates of his armor to find the heart beneath. Cleomenes staggered, looking down at the fletching that protruded from his ribs with the detached fascination of someone who couldn't quite believe what was happening to him. "Brother," he whispered, reaching out toward Alexios with a hand that shook like a leaf in winter wind. I can't feel my legs." Alexios caught his friend as he fell, feeling the warmth of blood seeping through bronze and leather. Cleomenes's eyes were already glazing over, but his lips moved in a final whisper that cut through the chaos of battle like a blade through silk. This isn't what we trained for." The words hit Alexios like a physical blow. This wasn't what they had trained for, this slaughter in the darkness, this betrayal of everything they had been taught about honor and glory. The perfect Spartan warriors they had been forged to become were dying in the dirt like dogs, their bronze armor no protection against the hatred they had helped to create. Nicomedes stood over the body of a helot child, a boy no older than 10 who had been carrying messages between the rebel fighters. The child's blood stained the olive leaves crimson, and his eyes stared up at the stars with the blank incomprehension of innocence destroyed. In his small hands, he clutched a wooden toy soldier carved to look like a Spartan warrior. "I did what I had to do," Nicomedes said, his voice breaking with the weight of what he had become. The state required it. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Around him, the battle raged with primal fury, but all he could see was the child's face. All he could hear was the small cry of pain that had been cut short by his blade. The nervous tic that had plagued him for years spread to his entire body, making him shake like a man with fever. "Movement ahead," Cleomenes whispered, his voice barely audible above the night wind. The boy who had once calculated siege angles now calculated only survival, his eyes scanning the shadows with the paranoid intensity of someone who had learned that death could come from any direction. 50 paces away, concealed among the olive trees like a ghost made manifest, Theo drew his bowstring with the fluid grace of someone who had been born to kill. The arrow's bronze point gleamed dully in the moonlight, its target clear despite the darkness. Alexios, the boy who had once represented everything Theo could never be, now stood within easy range, unaware that his death had already been decided. But something stayed Theo's hand. Not mercy, that had died with his sister 3 days ago. Not hesitation, weeks of warfare had burned that weakness from his soul. It was something deeper, more primal, the recognition that some deaths were too important to be quick. Some enemies deserved to suffer as he had suffered, to lose everything they held dear before they finally faced the darkness. The signal came from deeper in the grove, the haunting call of a mountain bird that had never existed in these lowlands. Theo's lips curved in a smile that would have chilled the blood of anyone who saw it. The trap was about to close. Corinna emerged from the shadows like a goddess of war, her bronze sword gleaming in her hand, her face painted with the sacred symbols of her ancestors. Behind her came 24 helot fighters, their faces masks of controlled fury, their movements coordinated with the precision of wolves closing on wounded prey. They had learned well from their Spartan oppressors, how to move silently, how to strike without warning, how to kill without mercy. "Spartans," she called out, her voice carrying across the grove with the authority of command. "You have come far from your precious agoge, but you will go no further." Nicomedes had begun to shake, his nervous tic spreading to his whole body. This isn't what we trained for. This isn't honor. Honor is whatever serves Sparta," Pantite said, his voice rising with the fervor of absolute conviction. "Everything else is weakness. Everything else is betrayal." As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, forsworn brothers stood in the ashes of their childhood dreams. The bonds that had united them through years of training were dissolving in the face of moral choices that would define what kind of men they became. The perfect Spartan that Pantites had become was a monster. The doubts that plagued Alexios were seeds of humanity trying to grow in poisoned soil. In the shadows, Theo watched and planned, his sister's blood calling out for vengeance. The reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, none of them would be prepared for the price of the choices they had made. The Forge of Sparta. Chapter 7. The Collapse of the Phalanx. The ancient olive grove stretched like a cathedral of silver and shadow beneath the pale moon, its twisted branches reaching toward the stars like the gnarled fingers of dying gods. Here, in this sacred space where Spartan children had once played at being heroes, the final act of tragedy would unfold with the inexorable weight of fate itself. Alexios moved through the trees with the careful precision of a hunter, his bronze armor dulled with mud and ash to prevent reflection. Around him, the surviving members of his unit, barely 30 of the original 200, spread out in a loose perimeter. 3 weeks of guerrilla warfare had transformed these proud young warriors into something harder and more desperate, their faces bearing the hollow look of men who had seen too much death and dealt too much of it in return. "We have weapons," she said, gesturing to the cache of bronze spears and shields that filled the cave. "Tools your people made turned against their makers. The irony is appropriate. My son fights with them," Damon whispered, his voice breaking. "Alexios. He's somewhere in the mountains, probably killing Helot children in the name of Spartan honor. How do I fight a war against my own blood?" The question hung in the air like incense from a funeral pyre. Around them, the alliance that should have been impossible was taking shape. Helots, Perioeci, and even some Spartiates who had grown sick of the system that consumed everything it touched. United not by shared values but by shared desperation, they prepared for battles that would tear the fabric of their world beyond repair. Back in the burning village, Alexios stared at the dead girl's face and felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't war, it was slaughter. The enemies they faced weren't soldiers but farmers, craftsmen, children. The glory he dreamed of during his agoge training had curdled into something that tasted like ashen blood. "We should move," Cleomene said, his voice carefully neutral. "The smoke will draw more rebels." But Pantites lingered, studying the corpse with the detached interest of a scholar examining a specimen. "Look at the bone structure," he said conversationally. "Classic Helot features. Probably would have grown up to breed more rebels. We did the state a service." The casual dehumanization in his voice made Alexios step back involuntarily. This was his sworn brother, the boy who had shared his training, his meals, his dreams of glory. Now he stood over a child's corpse and spoke of genetic destiny as if discussing the weather. "She was 8 years old," Alexios said quietly. "Old enough to carry messages," Pantites replied. "Old enough to hate us. Age doesn't matter, only loyalty to the state." The irony wasn't lost on him. A Spartan warrior protecting a Helot child from his own people. Each day brought new contradictions, new choices that forced him to confront the fundamental brutality of the system he'd sworn to serve. The intelligence he'd failed to deliver had cost Spartan lives, but saving this one child somehow felt more important than all the strategic victories in the world. The patrol's voices grew closer, their words carrying the casual cruelty of men who had learned to see Helots as vermin to be exterminated. Lysander recognized the voice of Bruises, his former instructor, discussing the most efficient methods of clearing suspected rebel sympathizers. "Burn the whole quarter," Bruises was saying. "Smoke them out like rats. The ones who run are guilty, the ones who stay are fools." Lysander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every lesson he'd ever been taught about Spartan duty and honor. The child beside him trembled, and he found himself humming a lullaby his own mother had sung, a memory from before the state had claimed his soul. Deep beneath the mountain, in a network of caves that had sheltered Messenian rebels for generations, Corinna met with an unlikely ally. Damon the Perioeci craftsman sat across from her, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap, his face etched with the lines of a man who had been forced to choose between survival and conscience. "My workshop burns," he said quietly. "My neighbors are dead or fled. The Spartans suspect every Perioeci of treachery now. There's no middle ground left." Corinna nodded, understanding the bitter truth of his words. The rebellion had shattered the careful balance that had maintained Spartan society, forcing every person to choose a side. The Perioeci, who had once existed in the space between citizen and slave, now found themselves hunted by both. "She was running," Nicomedes whispered, his nervous tick pulsing rapidly. "Just running." "She was moving with purpose," Pantites countered, his voice flat. "Could have been carrying intelligence. Could have been coordinating with the rebels. We followed protocol." From the shadows 50 paces away, Theo watched his sister's blood pool in the dirt and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Melia had been trying to reach the safe house they'd established in the old temple ruins, carrying the mirror their mother had given her before the Cryptia killed her 2 years ago. Now she lay motionless, another casualty of Spartan efficiency. He knew the faces of her killers, had studied them for years from his hidden observation posts. The one who had thrown the spear was Pantites, son of the hero who died at Thermopylae. The others were Alexios, Cleomenes, and Nicomedes, sworn brothers who had trained together since childhood. They stood over his sister's body like statues, their bronze armor gleaming in the firelight. Theo's hand moved to his bow, arrow knocked and ready. He could kill at least 2 of them before they could react. But something stayed his hand, not mercy, but calculation. A quick death was too easy. They deserved to suffer as he was suffering, to lose everything they held dear before they finally died. He melted back into the shadows, marking their faces in his memory like a hunter marking prey. 2 miles away, in the wine cellar of an abandoned Perioeci workshop, Lysander crouched beside a terrified helot child whose parents had been killed in the previous night's raids. The boy couldn't be more than 6, his dark eyes wide with the kind of trauma that aged souls beyond their years. Above them, they could hear the heavy footsteps of a Spartan patrol conducting house-to-house searches. "Stay quiet," Lysander whispered, his hand gentle on the child's shoulder. "They'll pass soon." The Forge of Sparta. Chapter 6. Ashes of Brotherhood. The night air reeked of smoke and blood as Alexios pressed himself against the rough stone wall of a burning granary. 3 days of guerrilla warfare had transformed the mountain villages into a hellscape where shadows moved with deadly purpose and every sound might herald death. His bronze armor, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a burden that marked him as a target for every helot archer hidden in the darkness. "Movement, 50 paces east," Cleomenes whispered, his voice tight with the strain of constant vigilance. The boy who had once calculated angles like a siege engineer now calculated only survival. Alexios squinted through the acrid smoke, trying to distinguish friend from foe in the chaos. The rebellion had erupted with a ferocity that had caught even veteran Spartan commanders off guard. What should have been a simple suppression operation had devolved into a nightmare of ambushes, night raids, and civilian casualties that made distinguishing combatants from innocents impossible. A figure darted between the ruins of a collapsed workshop, small, quick, carrying something that glinted like bronze in the firelight. Pantites moved before anyone could think, his spear finding its mark with the precision of 8 years' training. The target fell without a sound, tumbling into the shadows between 2 burning buildings. "Clean kill," Pantites muttered, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Alexios' skin crawl. "That's 7 tonight." They approached the body cautiously, weapons ready for ambush. What they found made Alexios' stomach turn to lead. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, her dark hair matted with blood, clutching a bronze mirror that had caught the firelight. Not a weapon, a keepsake, probably her mother's, carried as she fled the burning village. Corinna watched the flames dance against the sky, and felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope, not the desperate hope of the dying, but the fierce hope of those who had chosen to fight rather than endure. Around her, the mountain villages came alive with the sound of war cries in the ancient tongue. Words that had been forbidden for centuries now shouted from every rooftop. "For Messenia!" she cried, raising her bronze sword toward the signal fire. "For our children! For our dead!" The response thundered back from 1,000 throats, a sound that made the very mountains tremble. The Helots had found their voice, and it would not be silenced easily. Lysander stood frozen as the rebellion exploded around him, Helot fighters streaming past his position toward their assigned targets. The message in his cloak could still save Spartan lives, could still prevent the bloodbath that was about to engulf the mountains. His duty demanded action, his training compelled obedience. But as he watched a Helot woman, barely more than a girl, hurl herself at a Spartan overseer with nothing but a kitchen knife and boundless fury, Lysander realized that some things were more important than duty. Some truths were more powerful than training. Some choices defined not just what a man did, but what he became. The collision was inevitable now. Friend would face friend, brother would fight brother, and the rigid certainties that had sustained Spartan society would crumble in the face of human complexity. Blood would flow like water, and when it was over, none of them would be the same. The age of heroes was ending, and the age of consequences had begun. The column formed with practiced precision, 200 Spartan warriors, 500 Perioeci auxiliaries, and a handful of Helot guides whose loyalty had been secured through threats to their families. As they marched toward the mountain villages, Alexios caught glimpses of smoke rising from distant peaks. The rebellion had begun. Theo crouched in the ruins of an ancient temple, his hands steady as he fitted an arrow to his bowstring. The boy who had once watched Spartan training from the shadows had become something harder, more focused. Around him, 15 Helot fighters waited for his signal, their faces painted with ash and blood in the old Messenian war patterns. "They come," whispered Stavros, the blacksmith's son who had inherited his father's hatred along with his forge. 200, maybe more. The young ones wear new armor. Theo nodded, his mind calculating distances and angles with the precision of a born hunter. The ambush site had been chosen carefully, a narrow pass where superior numbers would count for little, where Helot knowledge of the terrain would balance Spartan training. It was here that the rebellion would draw its first blood, here that the myth of Spartan invincibility would be tested. The signal fire blazed to life on Mount Taygetus as the sun reached its zenith, sending pillars of smoke into the clear mountain air. Across the Peloponnese, Helot villages erupted in coordinated violence as generations of suppressed rage finally found expression. Overseers died in their beds, Perioeci workshops burned, and the carefully maintained order of Spartan society collapsed into chaos. Yet his hand trembled as he approached the designated drop point. The faces of the Helot children he'd watched starve haunted him. The dignity of men like Orestes, who had endured decades of humiliation without losing their humanity, made a mockery of everything he'd been taught about Spartan superiority. The woman Corinna, whose intelligence and courage would have made her a formidable Spartiate in different circumstances, forced him to confront the arbitrary nature of the social order he served. The message remained undelivered. In the agoge compound, Brasidas assembled the graduating class with the grim efficiency of a man preparing for war. Alexios stood with his sworn brothers, their bronze armor gleaming in the morning light, their faces masks of controlled anticipation. 8 years of training had culminated in this moment, their first real test as Spartan warriors. The Helots stir, Brasidas announced, his scarred face betraying no emotion. Intelligence suggests coordinated rebellion across the mountain villages. You will march with the regular forces to restore order. This is not a training exercise. This is not a game. You will kill or be killed, and the state will judge you accordingly. Alexios felt his stomach twist with something that might have been fear or excitement. Beside him, Pantites nodded with the cold satisfaction of someone who had already learned to find pleasure in others' pain. Cleomenes maintained his characteristic silence, while Nicomedes betrayed his anxiety through the nervous tic that had developed over years of pressure. Remember, Brasidas continued, Helots are not soldiers. They are animals that have forgotten their place. You will remind them. 5 days, Corinna whispered to her assembled cell leaders, her voice barely audible above the wind that howled through the sacred cave. 5 days until the moon is dark enough to hide our movements. Around her, 23 faces reflected the weight of accumulated generations of suffering. Some were young, their eyes burning with the fierce hope of those who had never known freedom. Others were old, scarred by previous failed uprisings, their expressions tempered by the knowledge of what failure would cost. The weapons cache had grown steadily over the months. Stolen spears, improvised shields, bronze tools hammered into crude but effective blades. More importantly, they had cultivated allies among the Perioeci, men like Damon whose sons fought in Spartan ranks but whose hearts had grown sick of the system that consumed everything they touched. The fire signal will come from Taygetus, Corinna continued, her finger tracing the mountain's silhouette on their rough map. When you see it, you move.
No hesitaschen. No merci.
The Spartans have shown us none, and we will return the favor. Lysander felt the weight of the sealed message in his cloak like a stone pressing against his chest. 3 days of intelligence gathering had produced a detailed report on rebel movements, weapon caches, and leadership structures. The information would allow the Cryptii to crush the uprising before it truly began, saving countless lives on both sides. His duty was clear, his loyalty absolute. Survival requires choices, Corinna replied, her blade never wavering. Tomorrow, the overseers will announce new quotas.
Impossible quota.
Children will starve so that Spartan warriors can feast. Will you watch in silence? Or will you help us ensure that some of our people live? The question hung between them like a blade poised to fall. Lysander understood that his answer would determine not just his mission's success, but the kind of man he would become. In the distance, the first signal fire flickered to life on Mount Taygetus, and the fate of Sparta began to shift like stones in an avalanche. The foundations of his world were crumbling, and Lysander no longer knew which side of the coming war he wanted to survive. The Forge of Sparta. Chapter 5. Blood Oaths and Smoke Signals. The arrests began at dawn, systematic and merciless as a winter storm. Lysander watched from his concealed position in the olive grove as Cryptii operatives dragged 3 Perioeci merchants from their workshops, their screams echoing off the mountain walls like the cries of dying birds. The charges were vague: suspicious gatherings, unusual trade patterns, failure to report seditious conversations, but the punishment would be absolute. Paranoia had infected Sparta like a plague. Every whispered conversation was potential treason, every glance between helots a possible signal. The Perioeci quarter, once bustling with productive activity, now lay under a pall of fear so thick it seemed to muffle sound itself. Workshops stood empty, their owners either arrested or fled to the mountains. The delicate balance that had maintained Spartan society for centuries was unraveling thread by thread. Lysander's first real test came sooner than expected. Working in the olive groves, he witnessed a scene that would have been routine in his previous life. A Spartan overseer beating a helot child for dropping a basket of fruit. The blows were methodical, designed to inflict maximum pain without causing permanent damage. The child's crime was carelessness. His punishment was a lesson for all who watched. The old Lysander would have approved of such discipline. The man he was becoming found his hands clenching into fists as he fought the urge to intervene. Around him, other helots worked with studied indifference, their faces masks of compliance that hid whatever they truly felt. When the overseer finally tired of his sport, Lysander approached the sobbing child. "Here," he said quietly, offering a piece of bread from his own meager ration. "The pain will pass." The gesture was small, almost meaningless, but it represented a fundamental shift in his worldview. For the first time in his life, Lysander found himself identifying with Sparta's victims rather than its victors. That evening, as the mountain shadows lengthened, Corinna made her decision. The stranger would be tested, not through words but through action. She waited until the village settled into its uneasy sleep, then slipped from her quarters and made her way to the grove where the Perioeci newcomer had made his camp. "You're not what you seem," she said, stepping from the shadows with a bronze knife glinting in her hand. "The question is whether you're friend or enemy." Lysander's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, then stopped. The woman before him radiated a dangerous intelligence that reminded him uncomfortably of his own Spartan training. More troubling still was the realization that he didn't want to fight her. "I'm just a man trying to survive," he said, the words carrying more truth than he intended. "The Cryptia selections begin tomorrow," Pantites murmured, his voice carrying the reverence of someone discussing sacred mysteries. His own recruitment 2 years prior had transformed him from a boy seeking approval into something that barely remembered what mercy felt like. Alexios nodded, though privately he wondered if he wanted such honor. The Cryptia veterans he'd observed moved through the world like animated corpses, efficient and deadly but somehow diminished. Their success came at a cost he was only beginning to comprehend. From his hidden vantage point beyond the compound walls, Theo watched the final preparations with growing anticipation. 9 years of observation had taught him to read the subtle signs of Spartan routine. The increased security, the whispered conferences between instructors, the way certain boys were pulled aside for private conversations. All indicated that something significant was approaching. His role in the resistance had evolved from passive observer to active participant. The intelligence he gathered found its way to rebel leaders through a network of servants, field workers, and craftsmen who had learned to communicate through gestures and coded phrases. The Spartans might control the helots' bodies, but they had never truly conquered their minds. Tonight, he would meet with Corinna's lieutenant, a woman named Penthesilea who had risked everything to coordinate the mountain villages. The message he carried was simple but crucial. The agoge trials would leave the compound vulnerable for precisely 3 days. If the uprising was to succeed, that window represented their best opportunity. 2 miles deeper into the mountain, in a cave system that had sheltered Messenian rebels for generations, Corinna studied the faces gathered around the flickering oil lamps. 23 helots from villages across the region, each one a potential spark in the conflagration to come. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. "The signal fires are positioned," she reported, her fingers tracing routes on a crude map carved into the cave wall. When Taygetus burns, every village from here to Gythium will know. The weapons are cached, the safe houses prepared. We have perhaps 2 weeks before the Spartan suspect. An older man named Orestes raised a scarred hand. What of the new arrival in Kalamata? The Perioesai who claims to seek work. Corinna's jaw tightened. She had heard of this stranger, had even glimpsed him from a distance during the olive harvest. Something about his bearing troubled her. Too straight for a broken man, too observant for a simple trader. "I will test him," she said simply. "If he is what he claims, he will prove useful. If not..." She didn't need to finish. Everyone in the cave understood the stakes. Discovery meant death, not just for the conspirators but for their families, their neighbors, anyone who might have harbored sympathetic thoughts. The Spartans had perfected the art of collective punishment. In the agoge compound, the final trials approached with the inevitability of winter. Alexios stood with his sworn brothers, Cleomenes, Pantites, and Nicomedes, watching as older boys demonstrated the combat techniques that would soon be tested in earnest. Their bodies bore the accumulated scars of 8 years' training, but their eyes held something harder to measure: the absolute certainty that they were superior to every other form of human life. The rigid hierarchy that had maintained Spartan power for centuries was beginning to crack, and in those fissures, the seeds of revolution were taking root. The Forge of Sparta. Chapter 4. The Fire Beneath the Mountain. The Helot village of Kalamata clung to the mountainside like a wound that refused to heal, its crude stone dwellings barely distinguishable from the rocky terrain. Lysander adjusted his threadbare cloak, a disguise that felt more like a shroud, and forced himself to walk with the bent shoulders of the perpetually defeated. 3 days of living among the Helots had already begun to crack the foundations of everything he'd been taught to believe. His cover story was simple: a Perioesai trader fallen on hard times, seeking work in the olive groves. The identity came with carefully forged documents and a background that would withstand casual scrutiny. What it couldn't provide was protection from the growing revulsion he felt for his own mission. "You're new," observed an elderly Helot woman as she distributed the morning's meager rations. Her name was Talia, and her weathered hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned to make much from little. "What brings you to our mountain?" Lysander accepted the bowl of thin gruel, forcing himself to display appropriate gratitude. "Hard times in the valley. The Spartans, they take more each year." It wasn't entirely a lie. The tribute system had grown increasingly brutal as Sparta's military ambitions expanded. Even Perioesai merchants felt the weight of imperial taxation. But as he spoke the words, Lysander realized he was beginning to believe them himself. Corinna returned to her quarters in the Helot compound as the first stars appeared. The communal sleeping area buzzed with whispered conversations that ceased the moment she entered. Trust was a rare commodity among the enslaved, and newcomers were always suspect. But tonight was different. As she settled onto her straw pallet, an older woman named Penthesilea leaned close, her breath warm against Corinna's ear. "The mountain clans are moving," she whispered. "3 nights hence, when the moon is dark, the signal will be fire on Mount Taygetus. When you see it, gather the others. Freedom comes to those brave enough to seize it." Corinna's heart hammered against her ribs. After 17 years of patient planning, the moment of reckoning was approaching. She thought of her dead brother, of the countless Helots who had died in the Cryptia's hunts, of the children born into bondage who would never know the taste of freedom. Yet she also thought of the families who would suffer if the uprising failed. The Spartiates' retaliation would be swift and merciless, extending far beyond the actual rebels to encompass anyone who might have harbored seditious thoughts. 3 lives, 3 social strata, 3 perspectives on a society built on the systematic oppression of the many by the few. As dawn approached, each would face choices that would define not only their individual fates but the future of Sparta itself. Lysander stared at the ceiling of his family's modest but respectable dwelling, knowing that tomorrow would begin his transformation from reluctant warrior to active participant in the state's apparatus of control. Damon worked by lamplight, destroying any evidence that might connect him to the wrong side of the coming conflict. Corinna lay awake in the darkness, her mind racing with plans and contingencies for the rebellion that would either free her people or destroy them utterly. The Helots grow restless. Another effort continued. Our sources report gatherings in the mountain villages, whispered talk of rebellion. The state requires eyes and ears among them, someone who can move freely and report back. Lysander's throat constricted. They wanted him to become a spy, to infiltrate the very people whose labor fed and clothed Sparta. The assignment would require him to live among the Helots, to gain their trust, perhaps even to participate in their rebellious activities, all while preparing to betray them when the moment came. I am honored by the Ephesus trust, he replied, the words tasting like ash. But perhaps another would be better suited. There is no other. The first effort cut him off. Your family has served Sparta for generations. Your loyalty is beyond question. You will depart at dawn. That evening, Damon closed his workshop as the sun painted the sky the color of dried blood. His hands, permanently stained with metal and fire, trembled slightly as he secured the heavy bronze locks. The tremor wasn't from age or exhaustion, it was from fear. 2 of his Perioeci neighbors had been arrested that morning, accused of supplying weapons to Helot insurgents. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, but in times of unrest, truth became a luxury the state couldn't afford. Perioeci walked a knife's edge between suspicious citizens and resentful Helots, trusted by neither and vulnerable to both. Nikias, he called to his younger son, tomorrow you will begin learning the leather trade from your uncle. The forge is becoming too dangerous for young hands. The boy's face fell. Like most Perioeci children, he had dreamed of following his father's craft, perhaps even earning enough recognition to improve the family's status. But dreams were dangerous things in Sparta, and survival required accepting one's limitations. She had been 14 when the Cryptiae killed her brother Stavros, leaving his body in the town square as a warning against uppity Helots. The official charge was theft, but everyone knew his real crime had been learning to read. Knowledge was a luxury reserved for citizens, and Helots who aspired beyond their station were reminded of their place with systematic brutality. Now, at 31, Corinna had perfected the art of invisibility. She moved through the Spartiate households like a ghost, observing, listening, memorizing. Information was the only currency a Helot could safely accumulate, and she had been hoarding it for 17 years. The whispers had begun 3 months ago, carried on the wind like seeds of rebellion. Helots in the mountain villages spoke of coordinated uprising, of weapons caches hidden in sacred groves, of a network of communication that stretched across the Peloponnese. The talk was dangerous, lethal if discovered, but it grew stronger with each passing day. Lysander's summons led him through the narrow streets of Sparta to the austere chamber where the 5 ephors held court. These elected magistrates wielded authority that even kings respected, their power derived from their role as guardians of Spartan tradition and law. Today, their weathered faces bore expressions of grim concern. Lysander, son of Cleomenes, the eldest Epher intoned, "You have been chosen for special service to the state." The words sent ice through his veins. Special service could mean many things, none of them pleasant. Assignment to the Cryptiae was considered an honor, but Lysander had seen what it did to men's souls. His friend Brasidas had returned from his Cryptiae service as a hollow shell, capable of terrible efficiency but stripped of human warmth. 3 miles away, in the sprawling workshops of the Perioeci quarter, Damon's hammer rang against heated bronze with the rhythm of a funeral dirge. Sweat carved channels through the soot on his weathered face as he shaped a spear point that would taste blood in foreign lands. His son Alexios, now 15 and hardened by 8 years in the agoge, would soon carry such weapons in the phalanx, assuming he survived the final trials. The irony wasn't lost on him. Perioeci were denied the glory of citizenship, yet their skilled hands crafted the tools that maintained Spartan supremacy. They were neither free nor enslaved, existing in a twilight realm between the warrior elite and the helot masses. It was a precarious position that required constant vigilance and absolute political neutrality. "Father," his younger son Nicias ventured, grinding pigment for the workshop's decorative work, "why do we make weapons we cannot carry in battle?" Damon's hammer paused mid-swing. The boy was 12, old enough to understand the rigid hierarchies that govern their world, yet still young enough to question them. Such questions could be dangerous if overheard by the wrong ears. "Because," Damon replied carefully, "every man serves Sparta in his own way. Ours is to create, theirs is to destroy. Both are necessary." In the fields beyond the city walls, Corinna bent her back to the olive harvest, her movements mechanical from decades of repetition. The autumn sun beat down mercilessly, and the overseer's whips cracked like distant thunder whenever productivity flagged. Yet beneath her compliant exterior, something festered. A rage so carefully contained that it had crystallized into something harder than diamond. The lessons in silence were perhaps the most psychologically damaging. Boys caught speaking without permission were forced to hold heated stones until their flesh blistered. Those who cried out during punishment were given additional stones. Gradually, they learned to internalize their pain, to become living weapons that could endure any torture without revealing weakness. Theo observed these transformations with growing horror and fascination. He watched as laughter disappeared from the compound, replaced by the grim efficiency of young predators learning their trade. The boys who had entered the agoge as children were becoming something else. Harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. During their second year, whispers began to circulate about the Cryptiae, the secret police that culled helots deemed too dangerous to live. The older boys spoke of it in reverent tones, as if membership in this brotherhood of killers was the highest honor Sparta could bestow. Theo felt ice in his veins as he realized that his childhood observers might one day be his executioners. The selection process was as mysterious as it was terrifying. Boys simply disappeared from the ranks, summoned by shadowy figures who emerged from the darkness like death itself. Those who returned spoke of tests that went beyond mere physical prowess, psychological evaluations that measured one's capacity for calculated cruelty. Pantites was chosen first, his father's heroic death marking him as ideal Cryptiae material. He returned 3 days later changed in ways that went deeper than his new scars. His eyes held an emptiness that frightened even his closest friends, as if something essential had been carved out of his soul. "They teach you to kill without passion," he whispered to Alexios during one of their rare moments of privacy. "To see helots as nothing more than dangerous animals that must be controlled through fear." I had to prove myself worthy. Acceptable, Brasidas grunted, which from him was equivalent to a hero's eulogy. Now you learn to fight. The weapons training began with wooden swords and leather shields, but the lessons were written in bruises and blood. Boys who showed mercy were beaten. Those who fought with excessive rage were beaten harder. The perfect Spartan warrior was neither cruel nor kind. He was a tool of the state, to be wielded with precision and without emotion. Theo watched from his hiding place as the boys learned to move as one organism, their individual identities dissolving into something larger and more terrible. He saw Alexios stumble during a shield drill and watched Cleomenes seamlessly cover the gap, accepting a blow meant for his friend without flinching. The Helot boy understood that he was witnessing the birth of something that would one day hunt his people in the darkness. As weeks turned to months, the bonds between the four friends deepened through shared suffering. They learned to communicate through glances and gestures, developing a private language of survival that excluded their instructors. When one was punished, the others found ways to share his burden. When one excelled, the others ensured he remained humble. The psychological conditioning was more subtle but no less brutal than the physical training. Boys were taught to view emotions as weakness, empathy as a tactical disadvantage. They learned to recite the names of Spartan heroes while performing exercises designed to build calluses on their souls as well as their hands. A true Spartan, Brasidas would intone during their evening lessons, kills without hatred, dies without fear, and serves without question. Your life belongs to the state. Your death belongs to the state. Your very thoughts belong to the state. Form ranks, you pathetic offspring of dogs. Brasidas's voice cracked like a whip across the courtyard. Today you learn what it means to be Spartan, or you learn what it means to be dead. From the shadows beyond the compound's walls, Theo pressed himself against the rough stone, his helot's tunic blending with the pre-dawn gloom. At 9, he was already marked by the perpetual hunger that defined his caste: hollow cheeks, eyes too large for his face, hands calloused from labor that should have belonged to grown men. Yet something burned within him that no amount of oppression could extinguish. The dream of freedom, fragile as a butterfly's wing but persistent as the mountain wind. He had been watching the agoge for months now, learning the rhythms of Spartan training, memorizing the faces of boys who would one day hold the power of life and death over his people. Knowledge was the only weapon a helot could safely wield, and Theo hoarded information like a miser hoards gold. The first trial was designed to sort the wheat from the chaff with characteristic Spartan efficiency. The boys were driven naked into the Eurotas River, the spring current swollen with mountain snowmelt that could freeze a man's blood in minutes. Those who emerged first would eat breakfast. Those who emerged last would eat nothing until evening, if they survived the day's remaining ordeals. Alexios felt the water hit his chest like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and turning his limbs to lead. Around him, weaker boys began to panic, their strokes becoming frantic and uncoordinated. But Cleomenes caught his eye and nodded toward a calmer stretch of current downstream. Strategy even in survival. They reached the far bank as a group, Pantites dragging the nearly unconscious Nicomedes behind them. The act of mutual aid was neither praised nor condemned. It simply was, like the loyalty that bound the phalanx together. Individual survival meant nothing if the unit died. Yet even as Alexios felt his childhood being systematically dismantled, he couldn't shake the memory of Athens he had glimpsed during a diplomatic mission with his father. There, in the shadow of the Parthenon's rising columns, he had seen a different vision of Greek civilization. one where strength was balanced with beauty, where military prowess coexisted with artistic achievement, where the human spirit was cultivated rather than merely weaponized. The contradiction gnawed at him like a persistent wound. Was Sparta's path the only way to survive in a world of wolves? Or were they becoming something monstrous in their pursuit of invincibility? As the first day of training ended and the boys collapsed onto their straw pallets, Alexios stared up at the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. Somewhere beyond the mountains, Athenian poets were composing verses about love and loss, while Spartan boys learned to sleep with one eye open, ready to kill or die at a moment's notice. The forge of Sparta had begun its work, and there would be no turning back. The Forge of Sparta, Chapter 2, The Brotherhood of Iron. The dawn horn echoed across the agoge compound like the cry of a dying god, and 37 boys aged 7 stumbled from their communal sleeping quarters into the pre-dawn darkness. Among them, Alexios found himself naturally gravitating toward 3 others who would become his sworn brothers in the crucible of Spartan training. Cleomenes, son of a Perioeci merchant, possessed the lean build of a natural runner and eyes that calculated angles like a siege engineer. Beside him stood Pantites, whose father had died gloriously at Thermopylae, a legacy that hung around the boy's neck like a golden chain and iron collar combined. The third was Nicomedes, youngest son of an impoverished Spartiate who had pawned his family's honor for grain during the last lean winter. "Never forget," Bruises continued, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade, "that we are surrounded by enemies. The Helots outnumber us 7-1. The other Greek cities resent our strength. The Persian Empire still dreams of revenge. Only through absolute unity, absolute discipline, absolute loyalty to the state can we survive." The Cryptia, the secret police that hunted helots in the night, had killed 3 bondsmen just last week, their bodies left as warnings near the training grounds. It was said that young Spartiates proved their readiness for citizenship by participating in these culls, learning to kill without hesitation or remorse. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, Alexios began his first lesson in the choreography of violence. The boys formed ranks, wooden shields strapped to their left arms, practice spears gripped in their right hands. The phalanx formation was more than military tactics. It was a metaphor for Spartan society itself. Individual identity dissolved into collective purpose. Personal desires were subsumed into state necessity. Your shield protects not just yourself, but the man beside you, Bruises barked. Drop it and you betray your brothers. Break formation and you kill your comrades. The phalanx is only as strong as its weakest link, and we will break any weak links before they break us. The training was designed to strip away everything soft, everything merely human. Boys who wept were beaten until they learned to internalize their pain. Those who showed excessive mercy to defeated opponents were reminded that gentleness was a luxury their enemies would never afford them. The weak were culled not through execution, but through a more subtle process of social death, ostracism, denial of full citizenship, exile to the margins of society. The agoge system had been refined over centuries into something that would have impressed the architects of Babylon's ziggurats for its methodical precision. Boys were sorted by age groups, the younger ones assigned to older mentors who would beat discipline into them with the same systematic thoroughness that Spartan craftsmen applied to forging bronze. Alexios found himself paired with Demaratos, a 16-year-old whose eyes held the flat emptiness of someone who had learned that mercy was a luxury Sparta could not afford. "You will learn to endure," Demaratos said, his voice carrying no warmth. "Pain, hunger, cold. These are your teachers now." The The state feeds you just enough to keep you alive, clothes you just enough to keep you functional. Everything else you must take. The stealing was not mere survival, it was pedagogy. Boys who could pilfer food from the carefully guarded stores demonstrated cunning. Those caught demonstrated insufficient skill and were beaten accordingly. The logic was as brutal as it was effective. A warrior who could not procure supplies in enemy territory was a liability to the unit. From the helot quarters came the sound of morning labor, the shuffling of feet, the crack of whips, the eternal grinding of grain that fed the Spartan war machine. These were the descendants of conquered Messenians, kept in hereditary bondage to free the Spartiates for their singular focus on warfare. Alexios had been taught that helots were barely human, dangerous animals that required constant vigilance. Yet when he glimpsed Theo, a helot boy perhaps 2 years his senior, hauling water from the river, he saw something that troubled him. The boy's eyes held intelligence, perhaps even defiance. Their gazes met for a moment across the social chasm that separated them, and Alexios felt a strange recognition, as if they were both prisoners of the same pitiless system, merely confined in different cells. The Forge of Sparta. Chapter 1. The Scarlet Cloak. The morning mist clung to the Eurotas River like the breath of dead warriors, and 7-year-old Alexios felt the weight of his father's bronze-scaled hand upon his shoulder. Before them stretched the agoge compound, a collection of austere stone buildings that would devour his childhood and forge him into something harder than the iron of his future spear. "Remember, boy," Lysander's voice carried the gravitas of a man who had stood in the phalanx at Plataea. "You are no longer my son. You belong to Sparta now." The year was 465 BC, and the city-state that had humbled the Persian Empire at Thermopylae was ascending to heights that would make even the gods envious. Yet in this moment, as Alexios watched other boys his age being torn from their mother's arms, he understood that Spartan greatness was built upon a foundation of calculated cruelty. Across the Peloponnese, in the marble-adorned streets of Athens, philosophers debated the nature of justice, while slaves from conquered territories served wine in painted kylix cups. Athenian boys his age learned to read Homer's verses, to appreciate the curve of a well-thrown amphora, to argue rhetoric in the agora. But here, in the shadow of Mount Taygetus, beauty was measured only in the perfect alignment of shields, and wisdom meant knowing when to strike and when to die. "The Athenians make pretty speeches," spat Brasidas, the drill instructor whose scarred face told the story of a dozen campaigns. "We make widows."